Are you confused about racism? Do you have trouble understanding who and what is racist? Do the definitions you try to follow seem to change all the time? Are you unsure why someone just called you a racist? If so, you are not alone. My name is Jeff Mann. I'm a professor of religious studies here at Susquehanna University and teach courses in ethics and diversity. In this video, I'd like to help you understand better what is going on in higher education with regard to race and tell you what I see as the problem with the new racism. If you're like me, you grew up believing that a racist was a person who believed one race or ethnic group was superior to another. And racism is that belief, or behaviors that spring from that belief. After all, that is what the Oxford English Dictionary said. Now, it was worth asking if some people were racist without admitting it, to others or to themselves, but it was a pretty clear concept. However, if you use that dictionary definition today in many circles, people will be very disappointed in you. Newer definitions are not simply alternatives or even preferred, they are often demanded. These changes in definitions are not really new. I saw this beginning to happen way back when I was in college. I remember a mid-level administrator telling me that racism required the presence of power. Therefore, Blacks could not be racist because they are not the race with power in the United States. This seemed like a political move to me at the time, and I still think it is. I believe what she was talking about is better categorized as racial discrimination. You need some power to discriminate. Moreover, I remember thinking that if a Black guy twice my size kicks my ass because he despises white people, that would seem to suggest he's got some power, and we might just consider him a racist. In later years, when I raised this objection, it was explained to me that for racism to be racism, there had to be institutional power behind it, not just any power. Therefore, only whites can be racist. Critical race theories have defined it this way. Racism is different from racial prejudice, hatred, or discrimination. Racism involves one group having the power to carry out systematic discrimination through the institutional policies and practices of the society and by shaping the cultural beliefs and values that support those racist policies and practices. Again, to me, that just seemed like the creation of a post hoc definition designed to advance a specific political agenda. We'll just keep changing the definition of the word until we get what we want. And it still didn't make a lot of sense to me. Was Hitler not racist before 1933 because there was no institutional power behind his anti-Semitism? If he had been captured after World War II and sent to spend the rest of his life in a cell in Israel, would he have ceased to be racist because he no longer had any institutional power? That just seems strange. Now, to their credit, there are those who speak of overt and covert racism, or individual and institutional racism. This is a bit clearer, but I still believe the latter is better described as institutional racial discrimination, not racism. Much more recently, in 2019, Ibram Kendi published a bestseller, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And that changed the definitions again. It is hard to understate its influence in higher education today. And if you want to understand what is happening on college campuses today, you need to understand his argument. So pay attention. Kendi defines racism as a combination of policies and ideas that produces and normalizes racial inequities. This racism has nothing to do with individual discrimination. We are no longer speaking of individual beliefs and actions. When we do that, we are distracting people from the real problem. The big problem is the institutional kind of racism. And people, like me, who still talk about the traditional concept of racism are a danger. We are a distraction from addressing the larger problem. Thus, supporting or defending the existing policies and ideas that produce and normalize racial inequities is to be racist. Fighting against those ideas and policies is then anti-racist. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. You can't sit on the fence. You can't decide on inaction. If you are not fighting the anti-racist fight, you are complicit with the racist structures. Being passive is not an option. There is no non-racist. In the words of Edmund Burke, the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. You are either fighting under the anti-racist banner or you are racist. This is why so many colleges and universities are now declaring their intentions to be anti-racist. After all, being non-racist is the same as being racist. In Kendi's own words, when you have a society with racial inequity as the norm, to do nothing in the face of that norm is to allow that norm to persist, is to essentially be racist. Remember when the slightest slip or faux pas could get you labeled a racist? Well, now you're a racist without having done anything. Or more precisely, you're racist because you haven't done anything. Again, Kendi is clear. I'm hoping that people take away from the book that there's only racist and anti-racist. Most white people would say, I'm not racist. And if they're saying and they're swearing that they're not racist, then chances are they're being racist. Now, let's get to the main point of this video. Here are the two problems that I see with this new racism. Kendi says, if racist policies lead to racial inequity, anti-racist policy leads to racial equity. Okay, we understand what he means here. Let's ignore the fact that racial equity is not something we want universalized. In a perfect world, there would still be racial inequity in some contexts. Consider the meritocracy of professional sports. We are far from racial equity there, but that is not because of flawed policies. The same is true with the number of Indian Americans who are winning spelling bees. Different cultures and subcultures may emphasize different values, and different behaviors will follow from that. But that's not the point here. Kendi is condemning racist policies that lead to unjust racial inequity. And all of us can get on board with that. Here's the big problem. Which policies lead to unjust racial inequity? That is far from obvious in many cases. Many of you may believe that raising the minimum wage will help the poor and improve racial equity in earnings. Maybe. But there are a lot of good, kind-hearted economists out there who would say, no, that's going to hurt poorer Blacks and Latinos, not help them. It will exacerbate racial inequity. So, is raising the minimum wage racist or anti-racist? And who gets to decide? Some schools lower the bar on admissions for certain ethnic groups. Is that a policy that helps or hurts those students? On the one hand, it gives some people an opportunity they wouldn't otherwise have had. On the other, if it places them in an environment where they aren't a good academic fit and they are more likely to drop out, that's a serious problem. Are those policies racist or anti-racist? And who gets to decide? We find the same thing with the discussion of charter schools and school vouchers. People who are no less intelligent, virtuous, and informed than you are disagree with you on the topic. Who is racist? Who gets to decide? More police or police defunding? More social services or a stronger economy? Work requirements for welfare recipients? Special programming and resources for faculty and students of color? Who gets to decide what is racist? The big problem is that in our hyper-polarized echo chambers, we've convinced ourselves that the other side is stupid, stubborn, and/or selfish. They must be the racists. Guess what, Buttercup? Intelligent people of good character disagree on lots of things, including what will reduce unjust racial inequity. So who gets to decide? I can tell you one thing, it's not going to be me. It's going to be the folks with the most power. And colleges and universities are supposed to be places where ideas are evaluated by their intellectual worth, not the power of the one making the claim. The other problem here is reducing ourselves to two categories. anti-racists, and racists. If you're not with me, then you're my enemy. You may have heard that only a Sith deals in absolutes. I'm not sure if that's true, but this is still a very dangerous ethical position. You must be on my side, or you are racist. If you don't support me, you are complicit with the enemy. Those of you who know world history know that is a dangerous principle to follow. So, where does this leave us? You might have guessed where I stand. Go back to the original meaning of racism. It's clearer and functions a lot better than politicized newer meanings. Those tend to leave us with jargon-filled propaganda. Call racists racist. Call bias bias. Call discrimination, intentional or unintentional, what it is. And recognize that all human beings are subject to these things. And if you're going to insist on calling policies racist, don't be so arrogant as to think that you always know best what is and isn't beneficial for folks. Educate yourself on what others think. This is what it comes down to. Until we can regain the ability to recognize honest disagreements for what they are, things on campus and across the country are only going to get worse. Sorry.